there was still more work for me to be done in terms of releasing the shame. And that's really a part of like why I had to sit down and make this video. Like, I'm so transparent about so many other parts of my life except this. And the reason for that, I realized, is because I was still carrying around so much of that shame and so much of that stigma. Hey y'all, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Cecily, also known as Bad Fat Black Girl. I'm a writer, I'm an entertainment journalist, I'm a trap feminist, and I have an eating disorder. Yes, I feel like I've only ever mentioned it in passing in the past, and I want to take this video to just be more transparent about it publicly. But it's actually something that's super complicated and something that deserves more conversation and more attention. And I've dealt with so much of it by myself. Having an eating disorder is so lonely and isolating. Part of the reason I wanted to make this video is so that it would feel like less of this secret that I am carrying around. Before I get into all of this, please give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel. Now would be a good time to maybe drop like a heart emoji or some words of encouragement, because I don't know how emotional this video is going to get yet. Yeah. Also, because this is kind of like a sensitive topic that I'm talking about for the first time, I have some notes in front of me. So if you see my eyes kind of like wander off, it's just because I'm looking at what I've written down. I just really wanted to make sure that there were specific things that I really wanted to make sure that I hit on. And yeah, I just thought it might be better to have notes. So please forgive if my eyes seem diverted and like I'm not looking at you guys. The first thing I kind of want to talk about is why I have not felt comfortable talking about my eating disorder in this very public way before. The very oversimplified reason is because I'm fat and because I'm black. Eating disorders, at least in my experience and in the experience of a lot like my community of black folks, it just is not something that is acknowledged among black folks. We culturally have a very specific relationship to food, and I feel like that kind of relationship and that culture has not left a lot of room for language or ability to kind of identify with eating disorders and what they are. I know we on this cute like therapy is for black girls and mental health wave right now, but that shit is relatively new, and they have not gotten to the eating disorder part of the program yet. But seriously though, like in our communities and in our family, do we ever question like, why my granny got like 3 cakes over here? Like all my cousins don't be over here like that during the week. Like why she need 3 cakes? Or why can't my granddaddy like get his, you know, diabetes under control? And it's like, yeah, we might say, oh, well, you know, you maybe shouldn't be eating that. Or like, yeah, we see that these, you know, this high blood pressure, like it's something that they're not getting under control. Like, you know what I mean? Like we might see other health conditions and see people who are not good with like food management, and we might say like, you know, we might comment on that or we might notice that, but we never take it that extra step to suggest that maybe there's something going on with the relationship that that person has with food, or that maybe that relationship is disordered, right? We just think granny can't get her sugar together. So I would say that that's, you know, one component of it, just not having that space, I feel like, within my community or culturally to even begin that conversation. Even to this day, like, and I probably will bring this up a couple of times, like there are so very few people who I actually talk to very intimately about my eating disorder. I think as a continuation of the way eating disorders just aren't really acknowledged among black folks, it's also really important to understand that fat people are often excluded from the narratives about eating disorders as well, because we are thought to be people who just don't have willpower or who just don't have self-control. We also live in a society that denies fat people like empathy and support and care. So to acknowledge how eating disorders might play a role in the lives of someone who is bigger would require us to say, oh, this is like a person who might need help, or this is a person who is struggling with something, like it requires that piece of empathy that we do not want to give fat people in like this diet culture that we live in. Like, really think about it. We don't even really acknowledge eating disorders that could possibly make people bigger. How many shows and books and movies, plays, and representations have you seen of anorexia or of bulimia? Okay. Now, how many of you have ever even heard of binge eating disorder, which is what I have?
Don't worry, I'll wait.
Right. Diet culture thrives by convincing us that eating is always within our control, that everyone is wired normally around food and our bodies, and that anybody who is not operating with food and with their bodies in a way to either maintain thinness or get to thinness is intentionally doing something wrong in order to like be at this, you know, on this other end of the spectrum where you're bigger. Like, that is how diet culture works. But that's a whole nother video. Not gonna get into that right now. But I will say, to that point, I think that as a fat girl of the internet, you know, a plus size influencer or whatever you want to call it, or just a fat girl who talks about self-love and confidence and all of those things, I thought that I was only allowed to have the platform that I have because I had a good bill of health, that I didn't have any like health problems, physical or mental, and that I felt like I needed to be able to like present some certification of my health in order to talk about being beautiful and being fat and being present and being seen on the internet. Like, I thought that my humanity as like a fat girl of the internet was tied to being healthy. So to then have to admit that I had like this eating disorder, I felt like it would be some type of betrayal. I felt like I would be letting other like plus size folks down. Like, I felt like the plus size community would like feel like I was trying to suggest that all of us are dealing with these food issues. It would prove all of those people who come underneath my pictures and say, you're gonna die of a heart attack and this is what's wrong with you and here's all of the health conditions that you have. I thought that it would be like proving them right, that like, oh, there is something wrong with me. When people would make those types of comments about like my health under my pictures, or you know, where everywhere else they would want to like troll me on the internet, I always like felt solid that I could be like, well, actually my blood work and my glucose levels and my heart and, you know, my blood pressure, all of that stuff is actually great. And I'm actually, according to my doctors, you know, healthier than some other people who smoke cigarettes and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And that, all that stuff might be true, but that's also just kind of ableist. It's supports this idea that like fat people should be invisible unless they're completely healthy, but actually I don't owe people health. Fat people don't owe anyone else health. Like, we let so many other people like have a right to be sick, and fat people deserve that too. But that's also a whole nother video for a whole nother day. Not everyone with an eating disorder, not everyone with binge eating disorder is fat. There are so many other factors that contribute to what a person's body weight is that is not directly related to what goes into their mouth. Like, to be honest, even right now, one of the reactions that I'm so scared of is that someone is going to use this video to try to invalidate like every other conversation that I've had about being a fat girl, being a plus size person, being confident, loving myself, loving my body, and all of those things. I know that they are going to try to negate that. That was like kind of one of my biggest fears in like making this video, to be honest. I've also just like internalized a lot of shame and stigma about, you know, my eating disorder itself. I've just like taken a lot of, you know, what I've just talked to you about in. I've believed a lot of that for a very long time. And again, that's why, you know, so very few people in my life actually know about it. Obviously, I want to change that now. So, as I mentioned before, I've struggled with binge eating disorder for most of my life, actually. And I want to just define what binge eating disorder is according to the National Eating Disorder Association. So is this defined as a severe, life-threatening, and treatable eating disorder characterized by recurrent episodes of eating large quantities of food, often very quickly and to the point of discomfort, a feeling of loss of control during the binge, experiencing shame, distress, or guilt afterwards, and not regularly using unhealthy compensatory measures like purging to counter the binge eating. It is the most common eating disorder in the United States. I just really want to emphasize that last point, that binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder in the United States, and yet it is probably one of the least talked about eating disorders. And again, I'm not going to go on a whole rant about it, but I just want to say that the reason for that is fat phobia. We do not want to admit that some people's brains are just wired differently around food, that some people's bodies are just different, that a lot of the times those are completely separate issues, although they merge in very specific ways sometimes. As I mentioned, this is something that I've struggled with for most of my life. I actually don't really remember, I know a lot of people who have like eating disorder stories, they can like really pinpoint a specific moment or a specific time or day or whatever when it like started for them. I actually don't have that. I was really, really young, and I don't really have a memory of when it started. I remember struggling with this for most of my life. And a lot of that makes sense for me. There's a lot of research that suggests that eating disorders, like a lot of other addictions and mental health issues, are genetic. So that could be why I've had this experience where it's just been such a permanent part of my life. When I interviewed my mom on my YouTube channel, we talked a little bit about that briefly, if you want to go watch that video. But it's actually been really useful for me to know that it's genetic, because I think for a very long time I thought that I needed to like do something to figure out like what the source of it was, like why is it here, like what is it doing. And that actually is, as now that I'm like experiencing recovery and really trying to work with it, that's not necessarily true. I don't actually need to understand why I have an eating disorder in order to overcome it. But I definitely know that I've had it on for most of my life, and I definitely know that other women in my family struggle with it as well. So for me, when my eating disorder was mild, what it looked like was needing food to really like just punctuate different moments of the day, like transitioning from like one class to another, or getting ready to go to an event, or finishing a shift at work. It was like no matter when my meal times were, every like new change in like scenery or change in like whatever I was doing, like I just needed like some type of snack, preferably like something sweet, but not necessarily. So when my eating disorder is mild, I'm just kind of like a grazer, like that person who just is gonna make multiple trips to the hors d'oeuvres table at the party, which is something, most people experience some form of overeating in one form or another. When it hits the criteria that I talked about earlier is when it kind of transitions into disordered eating. Like most people overeat at some point in their lives. That doesn't mean that everybody has an eating disorder. I'm just explaining kind of how I experienced it. When my eating disorder was at its worst, meaning when I was in like phases of like really intense binging, I would definitely eat like really large amounts of food in a day, like larger than normal. And the way I would do this, so like for example, like let's say I would have dinner plans. I would have the dinner plans, right? But like I would eat a meal before that. I would eat the meal at dinner, and then as soon as I got home, would also eat a whole nother meal, and that would be in addition to anything I already had to eat like at earlier in the day, and also doing my normal kind of like grazing. There have been times where I've eaten until I felt like physically sick. There was when my eating disorder was really bad, it was like this compulsive urgency to wanting to eat, and it would really draw me to like really weird foods that I would think would just satisfy whatever the urge was like the quickest. So like eating spoonfuls of just like peanut butter, or like cake frosting, like shit that's not like a meal, shit that is not made to just be eaten by itself. Sometimes I would eat food that was stale, or food that wasn't like cooked through all the way, just because I was in like such like a frenzy to like have something. Sometimes I compare it to like a drug addict trying to get a fix, right? Like in terms of like the ridiculous measures that I would go to satisfy the craving. But I think what is like a more accurate example in terms of how it feels is like maybe someone with like obsessive compulsive disorder who, you know, can't stop themselves from like shutting the door 3 times or, you know, counting or engaging in other kind of tics like that. It's like my brain just felt like whatever was happening or emotion I was feeling or not feeling, whatever it was, like I felt like I needed to have something and like have it right now, and as if like if I didn't, that like something bad, you know, like I just felt this foreboding that if I didn't have like certain types of foods that I don't know, like that I just wouldn't be well. So that's kind of what it was like when it was at its worst. You know, I would have phases where sometimes it was just, you know, I would go for, you know, sometimes weeks or months where it was very mild, and then sometimes I would go for weeks at a time where it was extreme and super bad. But I think the consistent thing throughout that kind of really defined binge eating disorder for me was just the shame and secrecy of it. That kind of is what really, you know, that's kind of how I always knew. Like, that's kind of how I would be able to separate when I was just like having a meal or when I was like in a binge. It was how comfortable am I with somebody else seeing that I'm having this right now. I was very adamant about appearing as if I was like a normal eater to like other people. I would eat like whatever was considered like an acceptable amount of food. Like when I was with other people, I would go out of my way to like self-isolate in order to binge. I got really good at like hiding food and like being really secretive about when I was even eating. Sometimes like I would bounce around from like groups or people, you know, from person to person or group to group, so that because I would be in a binge, but I could have this meal with this group of people and then bounce from with them and then go meet up with another group of people who didn't know what I was just doing and then eat with them too, but like act like I hadn't just, it was just like craziness, all for trying to keep up this like appearance that I wasn't like having this issue. I can't identify when my eating disorder started, but I definitely know that it was probably like my freshman year of high school when I did kind of tell one of my friends that this was going on. Like, I definitely knew at that moment that I needed help. I knew that what I was doing wasn't normal, and I knew that I needed help. But for years, that messaging around diet and fitness culture and all that shit, every day I still woke up like, you know what, today's the day. I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna just solve this myself. Every day it was like that thought. Like, today I'm gonna get this shit under control. I'm gonna go on a diet. Like, I thought that eating disorders, and a lot of people think this, I thought that my eating disorder could be cured with a diet, and that actually is not true. Diets actually contribute to a lot of people eating disorders, but again, another video for another day. But that cycle of thinking like I just don't have the willpower, I just don't have any self-control, actually like contributed to the severity of the eating disorder, because then when I would binge, I would go so hard because I would be like, because tomorrow I'm gonna start a diet. Again, it's one of those things where it's a fine line, because a lot of people think like that. A lot of people say, okay, I'm gonna start my diet on Monday, but you know, I'm gonna turn up this weekend, and you know, they might do that for 3 weekends, and then, you know, may or may not ever start the diet, but at some point their brain tells them to stop, maybe turning up on the weekends at the very least. Like, my brain just didn't do that, and it was like daily for me sometimes, especially when I was in like really intense periods of binging. It wasn't until very recently that I was able to like understand and accept that wasn't a solution and that wasn't going to help me. Like, I had to accept the fact that my brain is just wired differently when it comes to food. That's just the beginning and the end of it. Like, my brain is just not like everyone else's when it comes to food. Just like maybe somebody who has anxiety, someone who might suffer from depression, somebody who might have bipolar disorder. It's like any other mental health issue. It's not that this person chose to, you know, deal with, you know, schizophrenia, or that they just aren't meditating enough in order to overcome their no, like, that's just how their brain is wired around those certain things. That is what an eating disorder is, and it could be caused by different things. It might require different methods of treatment, but that's the ultimate bottom line of it. And I finally had to accept that as a reality. So in 2015, I finally sought out help for my eating disorder. I won't go into specifics in this video about what I did, but I can say it was life changing. It was immensely helpful, and if you want to DM me privately, I'm happy to share what it is. I just won't talk about it on this video. But what I will say, it was the first time that I had met other people who were open and honest about the fact that they also had eating disorders, which was a game changer. I was mind blown, and it was really like a huge step in a first step at kind of scratching the surface of some of that secrecy and shame that I felt about it. That kind of treatment is also where I found like hope and was able to visualize what a life could look like that did not involve me like obsessing over food all the time. It was where for the first time in my life I actually had like relief and recovery. Like, and no, like I wasn't like on a diet. It was like, no, like I just actually experienced relief for the first time. And it was damn near free. And I think that is an amazing resource for folks who are struggling and need help and need it soon, ASAP now. It changed the game for me. And again, if you want to know what that is, what I'm talking about, feel free to DM me on Twitter or on Instagram or shoot me an email, like whatever. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm just not going to mention it in this video. But over the past like 2 years, I would say, I realized that I still needed more help and more support. Something more intimate and just more comprehensive. So I finally went back to therapy. That is also what helped me realize that I didn't need to understand the root cause of why I had an eating disorder. I just needed tools to help me deal with my eating disorder on a day-to-day basis as I went to like live my life and moved through my life. And being in therapy has just shifted my perspective so much, and it's been so helpful in really actually relieving me of that like obsession and that shame around food. Because what I started to notice was that like even though I was binging, a lot of my thoughts and ideas about food were actually like so restrictive. And like even right now, like what I'm coming to like understand is I don't actually have like a connection to food like a lot of other people do. People who, you know, really have strong memories like tied to maybe their families or their cultures or just their personality or their mental health or any of that. Like I actually don't have that, and that is a new relationship that I actually have to like build. I also realized like since being in therapy that there was still more work for me to be done in terms of releasing the shame, and that's really a part of like why I had to sit down and make this video. Like I'm so transparent about so many other parts of my life except this, and the reason for that I realized is because I was still carrying around so much of that shame and so much of that stigma, and that was also what was making it part of what has made it hard for me to actually like experience real true recovery, which is what I'm like constantly working towards every day. So this was just like another huge step. I also made this video because I know how lonely this experience is. Like I can't even, you can only understand what I'm saying if you also experience living with an eating disorder, because the isolation and the way it makes you feel trapped in like this box of your own hell is so real. So I wanted to start the conversation for myself, but I also definitely want to say for anybody else who is struggling that I see you. You are not by yourself. It's real out here, and there's also help out here, and you deserve that help. And I also would want to remind folks to just be gentle with themselves. So with that, if any of this was useful, please give this video a thumbs up. And I actually really do want to encourage you to share this video just because, as I mentioned before, so many people struggle with this by themselves. And if this can be a resource to anyone or just a source of comfort for anyone, I really want folks to share it. So I really want folks to see it. If you have other questions or comments, feel free to leave those below. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, turn your notifications on so you don't miss any updates. I imagine that this will not be the last time I'm talking about this. And as always, thank you so much for watching.